Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Willie Costello, the AI ethics stream owner here at ACE. And for those who don't know, ACE is a global community of machine learning researchers, practitioners, and enthusiasts founded in Toronto, Canada. We host free live sessions just like this one multiple times a week as a way of showcasing the latest and greatest in AI and machine learning research. We also host social events and produce premium content delivered in workshop format. To learn more about everything we do here at ACE, please visit our website at ai.science and subscribe to our YouTube channel at ML Explained. So tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Alex Hanna. Alex is currently a research scientist at Google, and she completed her PhD in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to joining Google, Alex was an assistant professor at, I'm very proud to say, the University of Toronto in the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology, and the Faculty of Information. Now, Alex joins us here tonight to discuss her paper Towards a Critical Race Methodology in Algorithmic Fairness, co-written with Emily Denton, Andrew Smart, and Jamila Smith-Loud. Now, I'm really excited to have Alex here to discuss this paper because this paper is excellent. It's incisive, it's thought-provoking, and doing vital work. I'm not going to spoil any of the details. I'll let Alex present those. But before passing things off, let me say a few words to situate this paper within the broader literature. So as many of us know, there's been much discussion of algorithmic fairness in recent years. And much of this discussion has focused on examples of racial unfairness and bias, the sort of unfairness and bias that's found in data sets and outcomes of algorithmic systems. And the examples here abound. It's everything from pretrial risk assessment algorithms, predictive policing, facial recognition, the list goes on. Okay, but most of the response to these issues has been to focus on ensuring equal representation in the data or fair outcomes across racial groups. And what's been lacking from this response is critical attention to the way that racial categories themselves are conceptualized and encoded in data, and the downstream effects this can have on algorithmic systems. So this kind of critical attention is precisely what Alex's paper provides. And with that, I'll turn things over to Alex.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Willie. I really appreciate that. As Willie said, my name is Alex Hanna. This paper is called Towards a Critical Race Methodology in Algorithmic Fairness, which is joint work with my colleague on the ethical AI team, Emily Denton, as well as Andy Smart and Jamila Smith-Loud on the ethical ML team at Google. So yeah, this paper, we wrote it and it was presented in January, and of course many things have changed in the world between January and now, and so I wanted to start out with this article that researcher and anti-racist scholar Ibrahim Kendi wrote in The Atlantic on April 14th, where he had this article he wrote called "Stop Blaming Black People for Dying of the Coronavirus." And so just a little background, the Ed Yong has talked about in The Atlantic how the CDC data in the US on COVID infections was so bad that the Atlantic started its own effort. Furthermore, that when it came out that racial inequities were stark, there was a very loud call that we needed racial data that disaggregated infection rates and deaths of COVID-19 by race. And so we started getting that disaggregation. 29 states confirmed the extent of the racial disparities, as it says in the subtitle. And as data came out, Kendi stated, should states be collecting racial data? Yes. Do those data show racial disparities? They do. And that led to the question Americans have been arguing over since the beginning of the Republic. Why do racial disparities exist? Why are Black people generally being infected and dying at higher rates than other racial groups? That is the question of the hour. And then here's the turn. And too many Americans are answering this new question in the old familiar way. Americans are blaming Black people. To explain the disparities in the mortality rate, too many politicians and commentators are noting that Black people have more underlying medical conditions, but crucially are not explaining why, or they blame the choices made by Black people or poverty or obesity, but not racism. And he goes on to talk about how, um, you know, there's the kind of discourse focuses on race or something about Black people, Latinx folks, people who have been are being infected and dying of COVID at alarming rates, but yet not attributing to racism. And so he talks about how U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams said, lectured people about behaving better and treating the virus as not seriously. So I bring this up because it illustrates very starkly really what is, I think, a problem that doesn't really get hasn't really hadn't really been addressed or been addressed in kind of a limited way in algorithmic fairness. And it was really identifying what we mean when we think about racial categories and really thinking about what constructs those racial categories. And so, if you have paid attention to to algorithmic fairness discourse, there's, this discussion of the 21 different definitions of fairness um, that could be proposed depending on what kind of functional form it takes. So the demographic parity has, the probability of y, equaling 0 1, conditional on your protected group equaling this a, and then is there actually parity here? Same with equality of odds, other definition, as well as equality opportunity. And there is some kind of understanding here that there is this notion of A or B, that is this fixed notion of race, that there's something about that, about a racial categorization that one ought to equalize on or equalize across for whatever definition of fairness. So I want to take a step back here and talk about this idea of racialization, this idea of how that's played a role in quantitative social science more largely, and how that discourse has come into algorithmic fairness and what problems that it inherits there. So race is a social construction, and by a social construction, um, the project of actually defining race is not really given its due. And so one of the foundational texts in sociology of race is this text here, Racial Formation in the United States, um, in which the notion of a racial project is structured. Um, so the idea is that the construction of racial classifications, like all projects of classifications, are political projects. This is what Michael Omni and Howard Winant, who are the authors of this book, refer to as racial projects. And racial projects are simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial identities and meanings, in an effort to organize and distribute resources along racial lines. So these racial projects and their attempt at racial classifications tell particular stories about who is favored at the top of a racial hierarchy and who is relegated to the bottom of that hierarchy. In a word, they highlight the social constructedness of race, or as Ian Hacking has said, the act of quote unquote making people up. Our current racial categorization schemas, for instance, like those that undergird the US Census, and a similar one is in operation in Canada, have their historical roots in racial projects steeped in white supremacy and settler colonialism. And so that kind of racial project that it carries on into the ways that we do quantitative social science, of the ways that we actually classify people and read people into particular racial categories. So this is something that's been discussed as far back as W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in The Souls of Black Folk, and has been taken up by critical race scholars and Du Boisian scholars. So this text here, edited by Tufuku Zuberi and Werno Bonisilva, White Logic, White Methods, focuses on the way that racism inflects quantitative methodology in the social sciences. And they really take on the way that statistics has been really complicit in the development of these racial projects. So they say, the modern discipline of statistics actually grew out of the bureaucratic need to manage large populations and natural resources. If we're thinking back to James Scott and the management of natural resources, more specifically and perniciously, the field of social statistics emerged from the need to make differentiations between white Europeans and their descendants and other peoples. So Francis Galton was a major figure in the development of social statistics. He was also a eugenicist and a major proponent of using statistics as a means to justify racial superiority of European origin peoples. As Galton writes in his Hereditary Genius, the natural ability of which this book, in terms of hereditary genius, mainly treats is such as a modern European possesses in a much greater average share than men of the lower races. There is nothing either in the history of domestic animals or that evolution to make us doubt that a race of sane men may be formed who shall be as much superior mentally and morally to the modern European as a modern European is to the lowest of the Negro races. So this is text quoted in this book edited by Zuberi and Bonisilva. So and we see this all over in the development of social statistics. I think some folks have written about how Ronald Fisher, the famous IRIS data set that is a commonplace in data science tutorials all over the internet, was actually first published in the Annals of Eugenics. Fisher himself was a rabid eugenicist. So this development of this discipline has been made for justifying the superiority of European peoples and justifying white supremacy and settler colonialism. So there's some more stuff in the paper I encourage you to read on racial classification in histories, as well as work on sociology of race that talks about different dimensions of race, which I'm not going to get into here because I want to get into the punchline. It says 4 propagations for machine learning. It should be 3. Actually, 4 is fine. We'll go with it. So the tendency to uncritically adopt these racial categories as though they are simply referencing an attribute of an individual is a persistent and widespread issue in social sciences, and now in machine learning. And it's not a problem to be solved with a single methodological approach. We can't just apply a fairness definition, but we need to have continual engagement with sociology of race and critical race methodologies. So several provocations for machine learning. So the first is to think about the hierarchical and stratified nature of racial groups. So this is the first provocation, and it's a critical race challenge to the way we think about group fairness. Because group fairness is predicated on abstracting racial categories into a mathematically comparable form, group-based fairness, like equality of opportunity and demographic parity, deny the hierarchical nature and the social, economic, and political complexity of social groups under consideration. And so this has been echoed by Black feminist cultural geographer Catherine McKendrick, following Patricia Hill Collins, and how she discusses how approaches to equality have resulted in a quote-unquote flattened geography, which obscures unique oppressions encountered by Black women, and instead treating oppressed social groups as interchangeable. This also kind of happens in the discourses around intersectionality. You add race to gender, to class to XYZ as sort of enumerable, and then you have different social groups which are sort of interchangeable. Rather than the reference to sort of the original text of intersectionality as formulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, in which she moves from this metaphor of the actual intersection to this metaphor of the basement, and it's rather than one thing may put you in one basement and then there's a basement below. So this is more of how this idea of intersectionality happens, but rather having a group fairness metric equalizes these. So you are in this one group and we can interchange this. And this is a feature of anti-discrimination law in the US, which we'll talk about later. Latson, Billings, and Tate, who are critical race theorists in education, they criticize these approaches that say that all difference is both analogous and equivalent. And the political philosopher Charles Mills notes that the liberal underpinnings of both theoretical and methodological approaches towards equalization have historically tended to have significant detrimental consequences for racial minorities and only serve to advance a white, quote-unquote, racial contract. The second provocation is around measurement, so centering the process of conceptualizing and operationalizing race. So we're following recent work here on measurement and fairness by Abigail Jacobs and Hanna Wallach, and suggest actually taking seriously the problems of measurement modeling when considering racial variables. And so this brings in some great work by sociologists of race, Wendy Roth and Ann Morning, who disentangle the different dimensions of race and race membership, which includes observed race based on phenotype and interaction, self-described ancestry, and self-identification. And so this multi-dimensional understanding of race demands that we have different dimensions. Those different dimensions require different techniques of operationalization. More importantly, each of these different dimensions affects different outcomes. So for instance, observed race by phenotype has implications for computer vision models, while self-identification may be more appropriate for models of understanding political mobilization. So it actually really matters how you measure race, because that has different effects and it is not really let's say domain agnostic. It's actually quite domain specific. I don't really like using the logic of domains, but that's sort of a way one could frame it. And then lastly, the third provocation is around expanding the frame to focus on the processes of racism and centering marginalized communities rather than thinking about race. So this actually gets us back to the first point that's made by Kendi, and thinking about not only thinking about race as something kind of implicit or kind of individually held, but one that is socially constructed, and thinking about health disparities, educational disparities, disparities in incarceration and encounters with the criminal justice system, rather than thinking about these as processes of racism. So for instance, public health researchers Chandra Ford and Nina T. Harwa propose a methodology for the operationalization of race within health equity studies as a multidimensional context-specific variable that has a relational component that explicitly captures the effects of racial stratification on health outcomes. So taking race seriously within algorithmic fairness would be to understand how processes of racial stratification are implicated in the workings of socio-technical systems. And then lastly, in this paper, we call for algorithmic fairness to center marginalized communities in the processes of research into the fairness of machine learning and the ethics of technology more broadly. So again, Ford and Harwood call for researchers to involve community members in all aspects of research to obtain necessary consent and or buy-in and to share findings with community members. And moreover, I think there's kind of a rising discussion in machine learning and to think about participation, but also thinking about ways of participation that are non-extractive, non-exploitative, that are actually driven by community members. So I want to end with a quote from J. Khadija Abdurrahman, who underlines the importance of expanding the narrow frame from classification and understanding the concerns of affected groups. And so she says, it's not just that the classification systems are inaccurate or biased. It is who has the power to classify, to determine the repercussions and policies associated thereof, and their relation to historical and accumulated injustice. With that, I'll leave it there, and happy to be in dialogue and take questions.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. And there's so much to dig into here. So let's just start. So I think a good place to start would be going back to one of these core concepts in your paper of the conceptualization and operationalization of race and racial categories. And especially for people who haven't had the benefit of reading the paper yet, I wonder if you could say a few more words about what operationalization. It's a very hard word. What operationalization is, how it differs from the use of racial categories, and why this distinction matters.
Yeah. So that's a good question, and I think this idea of operationalization is this is it's in if we're thinking about this from sort of a realist or a critical realist perspective on the philosophy of science, we'll get into that. Is you have some kind of social construct in the world, and there is some way of measuring or turning that into something that you could use in sort of a quantitative method or even a qualitative method in some regards. And that process matters. That process is the outcome of many different kinds of um, you know developments in how you choose to actually quantify something. Um, and those processes have politics. Those processes are not value neutral. There's not some kind of positivist truth to what one can access about the world, but yet it has to be quantified, and decisions about quantification have their own politics. So so when we're thinking about that, that's part of the process. And the work by Jacobs and Wallach, I think, gestures to um, existing uh, pretty old theory on measurement, and that comes from psychology and social sciences more generally, which are these aspects of reliability and validity, ensuring that these constructs have these properties that make sense on the face of it, are internally consistent, can be accessed again and again and again, um, and there's clear fairness and ethical concerns within those measurements. So, this is when we talk about measurement and operationalization, it's very much in that vein, thinking about, well, these processes have quite a lot of politics embedded in them. This is very much kind of a canard that's in science and technology studies, uh, uh, thinking about the work of Ted Porter and Peter Galston, that really focuses on, well, how do we access things in the world? Like, where do those notions come from? And this becomes more and more impactful, especially if we're thinking about race and racial categories.
Yeah, and I'll say for people who haven't seen the paper yet, you have this really great table on the multiple dimensions of race that really gives this great outline of the different ways in which this abstract, concept of race can be operationalized and measured in these different ways, and the differences between observed race, racial identity, racial self-classification, phenotype. I think it's just really great. But kind of building on that, I think one of the things you highlight in the paper is that the way in which race is operationalized in data sets, in algorithmic systems, it's often unspoken, unacknowledged. It's not even mentioned. And I mean, you you mentioned the example of ProPublica's analysis of the Compass algorithm, one of these landmark studies in racial bias and unfairness of algorithmic systems. Even there, we're kind of left to make assumptions about how racial categories were encoded in that data. So I guess one question I have is like, well, what's the first step? Is it to have researchers or others, start, unearthing this themselves? Should other people be coming in to do this work for us? Where do we begin here when we don't even know these histories?
Yeah, right. That's a great point. Right, and I think and just to go back to the ProPublica example, I sent an email to Jeff Larson, one of the authors of that landmark article, and was just asking, where these classifications come from, and he's like, I just don't know. This is what we got from Broward County, Florida. So I contact my Pam Oliver, who's my graduate advisor, and who works with a bunch of criminal justice data, and in her work, this is sort of like, you could have an internal data set at one agency that has conflicting racial classifications encoded for one individual. And that's because the processes of data generation are so inconsistent. So someone has an intake upon being booked, and then there's some kind of police person who makes a kind of a visual assessment, and then this assessment it's made by is differed by how this person perhaps self-identifies, and it goes down the line. And so these data themselves are kind of conflictual, and so we like don't. I mean, it depends on what the case is, what's happening here. In our work, my more recent work on computer vision data sets, those that encode that code racial identity do them in actually wildly inconsistent ways. And so my intern this summer, Morgan Klaus Showerman, has a paper, a wonderful paper with Kendrea Wade and Katie Lustig and Jed Brubaker that focuses on how computer vision data sets that do facial recognition actually, what racial categories and what gender categories they actually have. And they're very much all over the map, like how they justify them. They sometimes say that they vaguely say that the data sets are diverse, but they actually don't try to actually theorize or measure race in some ways. In some ways, I think, some of it's, not to put this all on the data set creators, they don't really want to touch this stuff because they don't know. But then at the same time, when they do, you're kind of thinking about, okay, what is actually happening here? One of the most used computer vision data sets for facial recognition analysis is labeled faces in the wild, for instance. And on the subsequent study of labeled faces in the wild, they, upon some kind of unidentifiable process, these authors said, 80% of people in this data set are white, and 13% of the people in this data set are Asian, and then 7% are Black. Really not outlining, what that means, why there's only the three racial categories of white, Asian, and Black. And it wasn't really until the work, I think, at least in the face data set realm, that I think that the gender shades study by Joy Buolamwini and Tanit Jabru, where they actually start to problematize this measurement question quite well, where they say outright, like, race is pretty complicated, and we don't try to have a theory here. Instead, what we do is we use skin tone, and we use skin tone because this is a visual medium, and because we're not actually inferring race by visual inspection, in which itself is a very very dangerous game, and is tied to one's positionality and all the things you're discussing earlier. And so, that and they're saying this is in no means perfect. This is what we have access to, and there's actually many other types of measuring skin tone too, and they choose this Fitzpatrick scale, but there's anywhere from that scale to Rihanna's Fenty line that actually has something like 55 different skin tones, and there's kind of huge variation. And so for practitioners thinking about, if you're encountering racial data, thinking about, well, what is actually happening here? I mean, this is good to do with any data, just as good data practitioners. Where did this data come from? What is this data actually telling me? What is it actually trying to measure? But doing the due diligence and really trying to understand what's happening there. And I think, some of the work that I think we're doing that's coming out more, uh, um, and I've done a little work on lately, is trying to understand um, what good data documentation would actually look like. This kind of ties to data practices more generally. And I could go into that a bit later, but just to say that these things don't really get documented, they're sort of seen as self-apparent. And documentation practices about the construct, who annotated them, what we need to consider in annotation. All those are, those are given very short shrift in many of these discussions, especially within machine learning.
Yeah, documentation definitely seems like the first step, minimally. And one of the many reasons why this stuff matters is because, as you point out in the paper, like depending on which operationalization of race you use, the results for group fairness can look very different. And so you make a big assumption, whichever form of operationalization you select, and that can really skew, or well, it will really affect like what your results for the supposed fairness of your algorithm are. And that's why I think it's really important to keep this first major step in mind. Yeah. Another point I wanted to hear your thoughts about, and this is getting back to the point you made about racial classification and quantitative methodologies being inextricably bound together. Because I mean, I love this part of the paper where you go through the histories of racial classification and show how we arrived at our present day racial categories. But I think, reading through this and hearing about, the intersections of this with eugenics and with, political control, state control, this can make like those racial categories seem really suspect, really dubious, to the point that you might not even want to use them. They just might seem like junk data or something. But a point I really like in the paper is that you also emphasize that given the social reality of race, we can't just dismiss or ignore these categories, however dubious their historical context might have been. So how do you think we can productively use racial data, especially when we want to achieve anti-racist ends?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think the kind of perspective that we take in this paper is one from a very we take the point from Ruha Benjamin and Wendy Chun, that race is a technology. It is a type of technology. People do things with race. Race has historically been used as a tool of subjugation. Race itself arose with the rise of capitalism and the rise of settler states. And so the what's happening here is, um, doing things with race is thinking of it as a technology means that there's multiple things that one can do with race, or how that operates. And so, you know, we're not saying, some folks read the paper and they're like, you're saying do away with all classification, which, it's not possible. We are humans who do a lot of classifying. That's how we reduce data. It's kind of a dimensionality reduction procedure. We have to kind of class one thing here and one thing there. And I think the operative thing is taking this, I think, critical social perspective to those categories and thinking about, well, if I'm using race in this way, what does that mean? What is the sort of history of this category, and what are the politics embedded in it? And so, it wasn't until the 1960s, I think you say in the paper, that um, people that actually self-identify um, with the race in the U.S. Census, and prior to that, it was all interviewer identification, and um, and so understanding those differences, I think, is pretty important. Thinking about what those are doing in the world. I mean, I think it's important, and then I think really thinking about then the kind of use of race as, how I think really how it gets to be used in I would say in practice. So for instance, like it is erroneous to say that race is a cause, or and so there's actually a bit of work from the causality perspective, and in how race as a cause is just like a faulty, it doesn't make sense. So Holland discusses this in sort of a discussion in the book White Logic and White Methodologies, in which he discusses um, this mantra, no, was it no causation without manipulation. And so a causal factor has to be one that, if you are thinking about this, and if you're familiar with the causality literature, this potential outcomes framework, where you have to be able to have one kind of manipulation that would then lead to, like, different outcomes. And then you can then focus on these outcomes in aggregate and develop some kind of a a treatment effect, if your causal variable is the treatment. And so, that's not how it works in race. You can't snap your fingers and race somebody as white. There's actually this metaphor that Isa Kohler-Hassman uses in a paper that's called, has a really great title. Let me find it in the references, because I don't want to mess it up. But it's Eddie Murphy. No, let me get this right. Eddie Murphy and the Dangers of Counterfactual Causal Thinking about Detecting Racial Discrimination. And so this is a reference to this old SNL skit in the late 70s and early 80s, where when Eddie Murphy, he goes out in the world in whiteface, and he like, things change radically. He's on a bus, and then the last black man gets off the bus, and then everybody, they pop champagne, and they like, like, this is the secret lives of white people. And so, but that's of course not, it's meant to be, of course, humorous, because, like, there's no sort of like snapping your fingers and saying, now this person with all the same qualifications is white, and then we can measure some kind of outcome. And she's actually quite critical of audit studies that do this, where audit studies where they'll send out a resume, and although changes the name in the resume to be more quote unquote white or black sounding. And so, this is measuring something. It's maybe measuring the employer's, own implicit biases, or the recruiters, or whatever, but it is not actually measuring, quote unquote, a racial effect. It is measuring something else. And so there's a few different approaches to this in economics. There's this work by Maya Sen, this idea of thinking about, and this is very similar to sort of the way that Wendy Roth discussed it, but thinking about race as a quote unquote bundle of sticks, where it's not just a single kind of thing that you can manipulate, but there's other things. But thinking about it as this causal factor is erroneous. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think this might lead in nicely to a question, or really a comment we got from Peter in the audience. So Peter references this case. I'm not familiar with this, but it's a case where Stanford developed some sort of socioeconomic status correlation to education outcomes, which was then critiqued as kind of institutionalized racism. But Peter also points out that this seemed to ignore sort of like high success rates among certain races, so especially like Asians, South Asians. And I'm not sure if I'm, definitely glomming on to what Peter's getting at here, but I think part of the question is just about, these sort of proxies for race, or approximate proxies for race. What do we do with those? I think part of this question is also, if we're not dealing explicitly with race in some way or another, how can we really say that anything has to do with race? And I think this is where it's kind of coming back to that question of causation. So yeah, just in thinking about how race does overlap, even if imperfectly, with so many other variables that might fit in with data. Where's the proper place for race in this mix?
Right. So that's a good question, because it's pretty complicated and depends a lot on the method. But it also gets at this idea of the proxy. So the original Compass example, the actual forecast didn't actually have a racial variable, but they had many other things that could be considered proxies. Excuse me. So they would have, kind of, someone who's been incarcerated. How many misdemeanors do you have, X, Y, and Z. And so this idea that um, you know these proxies, I think, are kind of this idea of this proxy, and whether you can sort of like, I suppose, like de-race a data set is pretty suspect. But this idea of proxy is also sort of this thing that has legal and also methodological implications of what a proxy is and how it characterizes a thing. So there are some things that are very direct proxies. Zip code is a very obvious one in the U.S. where and in Canada, where um, processes of practices of redlining would uh, sort people into particular areas, um, and um, so I think like there are things that we know are proxies pretty clearly, just because what we know about housing, what we know about employment, what we know um, about the criminal justice system, and so these there's some things, they're pretty well established. I think there's so any kind of modeling, has to be pretty attentive to that. Um, I would say. I think there was another part of that question which I think I just totally forgot. But it is at least addressing this idea of proxies.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Okay, so to broaden it out a bit now, so your paper as it stands, I think, is primarily addressed to algorithmic fairness researchers. So I'm wondering, like, what do you think the paper's lessons are for AI researchers more generally, and maybe not people that are working on algorithmic fairness per se. And then also AI and machine learning practitioners in industry.
Yeah, for sure. So it's addressed towards algorithmic fairness researchers, but honestly, all of AI research needs to have a more holistic account of its effects in society, and therefore it has to engage, more with the social sciences, humanities, and legal scholarship. And when I use the term algorithmic fairness, I use it to discuss a particular academic field and literature. Um, or rather, sorry, it's less to describe a particular academic field and literature and more to describe a particular community of practitioners and debates. So, people coalesce around the ACM Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference, or FACT. That's not really a field in the sense that, let's say, machine translation is a field, or object recognition may be a field, or computer vision is a field. So I don't want to constrain our discussion to a field of AI that's, I don't want to constrain our discussion to say like algorithmic fairness. This is more lessons for AI and in ML and quantitative modeling in general. And so, I think about the engagement with AI research less in terms of political particular subfields and more in conversations about what affects that AI is doing in society and how it interacts with society. I don't actually care too much about the technicalities of a particular technology or particular sort of modeling, but I care about how it's used in the world. I don't really, I'm a sociologist. I have a rough notion of knowing about how facial recognition or the ML models work, but I have more of a concern about how facial recognition is being used for surveillance, state-sponsored harassment, other carceral logics and carceral institutions. And if we're discussing that, we have to talk about other kinds of institutions, the prison and military-industrial complex, police departments, public-private partnerships, housing, and the way racial discrimination moves through the systems. So, yeah, I think it was addressed to algorithmic fairness, but it's also kind of addressed more to AI research and what needs to be done. And so the kind of focuses that I'm thinking about, like this is the important thing is focusing on what this means in society, what this means in terms of different types of inequality, different types of domination, and what that means in terms of how to change practices that mean in computer vision, data annotation, which we talked about, and other types of things that are part of the AI research process. Um, so the implications, I think, for our practitioners are going to be different. For or if you're a computer vision person, if you're a person that does completely stuff with multivariate data, if you're a person that does natural language processing, all of these have different instantiations, but they start with, for me at least, how we think about inequality in the world. Computer vision, I think it's gotten a lot of attention because it's pretty apparent, and kind of sort of reading. This is what Simone Brown calls digital epidermalization, reading race on the skin, reading race on the actual image of the person. And this is this great quote uh, that that comes from Ruha Benjamin, which he says, and this is drawing on Frantz Fanon, where she says, people are seen, but they're not really seen. They're I'm getting the exact quote a little wrong. She put it much more poetically, but it's effectively that being seen but not actually seen, um, and so this sort of works in the other way. In other ways, in natural language processing, we've seen huge disparities in automated speech recognition, not being able to pick up um, African American vernacular English. We've seen it be in places of not understanding people with non-Anglo, kind of mid-Atlantic accents. Um, we've seen it in kind of multivariate data in medical devices. So they have different instantiations. But I think really starting, this is addressed more towards AI and quantitative methodology and how racial inequality moves through the world, rather than starting with the technology first and valorizing the technology, because starting with the potential harms rather than starting the particularities of the method.
Yeah, so to follow up on that and maybe press you further, I think some people might think, I don't think this, but some people might think that the responsibilities are quite different for AI researchers and AI practitioners. Some might think that, okay, the sort of societal harms or the uses of these algorithms, that all falls on practitioners, but AI researchers, they're just doing research. You might even think the reverse, that actually AI researchers bear the whole burden of responsibility here. And yeah, I'm just curious to hear, like, do you think the responsibilities are different for researchers and practitioners? Do you think one group bears a greater burden of responsibility for these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I don't really accept the distinction really to between researchers and practitioners. I know in practice that looks different, and I'm sure there may be some people in the comments like yelling at me, and they're like, "Oh, you get to sit around all day and write papers," or something of that nature. Um, but at the same time, the door is actually quite quite permeable. Between practitioners and researchers. And I was actually struck when I went to visit the Vector Institute in Toronto in the Mars building downtown, and it's across the hall from the Uber Advanced Technology Group, and so these are pretty permeable doors, both metaphorically and as well as literally. Um, and I want to get, I guess I want to get to a larger point, and this is kind of echoing um, this point that Kate Crawford made in a talk a few years ago, where she starts with this story of an engineer who is presenting on kind of a surveillance technology and kind of a method of I think facial recognition, and someone from the audience kind of raises their hand and they go, "Oh, can this be used for surveillance and policing, and what does that mean?" And the engineer kind of replies, "Oh, I'm just an engineer." Um, and I guess my response to that is, this is really isn't a defensible position. The practice of engineering itself has practices of ethics and responsibility, and in what those commitments are, and it's really an unjustifiable position to take. And something that I think is, you know, drawing back on another historical example, is the kind of example of nuclear engineers and cryptographers, and sort of during the Cold War, and many of them, I think, started to get into this field, in these fields, as sort of a matter of scientific practice, but then quickly it became very apparent that these, what they were doing were going to be used for pretty, direct weapons development, or cyber warfare. Um, and they developed their own organizations. So the Union of Concerned Scientists is one, as one that was fighting against nuclear proliferation. And then cryptographers also have been of a sense of having a sense of a strong kind of moral, um, having a strong moral um, backbone and resistance. And so there's this essay that I think gets referred to, which is I think it's called the Moral Foundations of Cryptographic. Let me get this right, because the moral character of cryptographic work by Rogaway, where he discusses, how cryptographers need to be paying attention to how their work is being used, and how it would be used as, a mass surveillance. And when Rogaway is writing, and he wrote this in 2015, he positions this is right after the Snowden revelations, and he positions Big Brother as sort of the enemy, and rather, like surveillance is multi-headed, and it's and only thinking about the big companies is not the big government is not sufficient. It's also um, about big companies, about big tech, about and also about all the little tech. There's a lot of smaller surveillance companies that are emerging now that are vying for contracts that are federal. Jack Paulson, who quit Google after it was unearthed that Google was developing Project Maven and Project Dragonfly, which was a search engine in China. Uh, just released a great report that was showing how many of the Department of Homeland Security contracts are being routed to these smaller subcontractor surveillance companies. So yeah, so I mean, like, first point, the door between research and practitioner is pretty open. It's a revolving door. Those who make the largest successes and researchers quickly get hired at companies because they have the resources. Number two, you know, both researchers and practitioners have moral obligations. Um, and sort of three, like these kind of exist at every level of the chain. And it really takes a concerted collective effort to resist these, this type of being complicit in surveillance, being complicit in policing, being complicit in military and prison industrial complexes.
Yeah, I think those are such great points. So we're nearing the end of the hour. So I think I want to end with the question that I end every session with. And I just want to ask you, where do you hope the field of AI ethics and fairness will go in the next 5 years? And where do you think it will go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is such a good question. And I really hope the field goes into the direction of integrating these insights from social sciences, especially critical perspectives from social sciences into practices. Um, I also hope that we start getting beyond just thinking about fairness as a matter of formalisms, um, as thinking about it more as a matter of justice. Um, I am quite pessimistic about this because one thing about the formalisms is that they're pretty legible to AI practitioners. They're pretty legible to AI firms. Um, there's also, and then there's also a lot of ethics washing happening. So, like I think what we're going to end up with, and I really hope we don't, and I'm hope trying a lot not to do this, and I hope the listeners of this will also push back too. But where I think the danger of where we would go is there being some kind of fairness or ethics certification for particular types of technologies that are really far removed about how these technologies affect people in practice. Where I'd really like this to go is really people who are working in the AI space to develop what Shannon Valor um, talks about as a kind of a techno-social virtue ethic. And she's working off of kind of a Aristotelian virtue ethics framework, and which you're trying to emulate and cultivate virtue. Um, and I think, and I would say along with that, having practices that are cultivated kind of in that draw from kind of critical social science, and I would say more of a critical resistance. And I think that has a lot to do with building solidarities, really thinking about what that would mean in practice, um, bringing people in the room who can actually speak much more, including the people affected, on how particular sorts of technologies will cause harm, and yeah, bring those people into the conversation. So yeah, that's where I hope it goes, and you know, that's what I hope folks will work towards and build solidaries to do.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I'll say if there's one thing that keeps me hopeful, because I'm also pretty pessimistic most of the time, but if there's one thing that keeps me hopeful, it's that there's people like you working on this stuff and pushing back against these opposing tendencies. So actually, last question. If anyone wants to get in touch with you and follow up about anything here, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, just go to my website, Alex-Hanna, or my Twitter, Alex Hanna. I'm on Twitter way too much. Trying not to be, but shoot me a line. Happy to chat.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us, Alex. And remember, if you want to view other live sessions like this, visit our website at ai.science or follow us on YouTube at the channel ML Explained. Thank you again for joining us and have a nice night.